Hello and welcome back. It's going to be the third part of our Skillshare class together, third and final. And so just as a quick review, this is where we've been and this is our final session. So the first module, as a quick reminder, we talked about a little bit of context for crowdstorming, the broader context of things like crowdsourcing and open innovation, and then we jumped into how to set up a brief and how to think about the brief, and then to motivate people with the right mix of incentives. And finally, we looked at the search pattern, which is, again, the simplest pattern where our focus is simply on how do we get ideas. And then we introduced the project, and you've already submitted ideas for that, so we won't spend too much more time on that. And then module 2, we added a little bit more complexity. We dug in a bit on recruiting. In other words, how do you invite the thousands of participants that you would like to join you? And then we talked a little bit about new patterns where the focus switches a little bit from not just ideas to other forms of participation. So people offering feedback and voting, and ultimately helping to improve the ideas and then eventually selecting them, which brings us to our final subjects for the day, for today, and those are idea selection. Obviously, it's one thing to go to all this trouble and gather the ideas, but now you have to do a good job selecting them. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what we'll call the gotchas, just the types of things that can quickly undo crowdstorms, and we'll talk a little bit about how to anticipate them. And then the final part, we'll talk a little bit about online spaces. So far we really haven't talked about technology or software or anything like that, and so we'll get into that a little bit later on today. So let's get started. So first off, we've gone to all this trouble of setting up a crowdstorm. We've invited the people, we've done our brief, we've invested the time and the effort to put together a coalition and put together the right incentives. And if the process is run well, regardless of the structure that we've decided to use or the pattern that we've decided to use, we now have a bunch of ideas and we have to choose one or choose a few. But we have to select the best ones. And so there's a well-proven approach to this, and I think most of us intuitively know that we can look to experts to make these decisions. This is what we've always done, and so I'm using the example here of Sequoia Capital, mainly because Sequoia is probably the most successful venture capital firm of all time. Right, so if you think of a technology company, particularly a company that has grown quickly in the last decade, Sequoia Capital was an investor. And if you look at how it is that Sequoia makes decisions, so Sequoia is in the business of every single day, people send them ideas, people send them plans, people pitch things to them in the hope that they would decide to support them, or more specifically, not just support them, but invest in them. And so this model works. I mean, the number of companies, I think in percentage terms, that are listed on the NASDAQ, is a testimony to Sequoia's success. Anyway, so this for me is the most classic model, right? You have experts. Experts review each idea and they make an expert assessment, and this is why they're experts. Right? They eventually develop a reputation for being able to pick the best, and investments are one example, but you can find parallels to this in lots of different examples. I mean, the equivalent of the partners in a venture capital fund might be the creative director at an advertising agency, or it might be your head of R&D in a research department. Okay, but the challenge for this is at some point you have to find a way to scale. You can certainly hire more and more people, but they're expensive, right? It's one thing to do it in a venture capital firm, because if you're making enough money, you can afford to pay all of these people. But how do you scale this, right? And so one thought on scaling this comes from an example project from Lego. And so what Lego's done is Lego faces a really daunting task. In fact, if you've ever met anyone from Lego, they'll tell you that usually the first thing that happens when someone meets them is they'll say, I have an idea for you, right? As a Lego fan, I have to share this thing that Lego must do because it's going to be fantastic, right? And so after a time, I suppose you get used to that, but how is Lego going to deal with it? Just this constant, what they call the tyranny of ideas. How do they deal with this ongoing flow of ideas that people want them to look at and get feedback on? And so one of the ways that they've figured out how to deal with this, and they've struggled with this problem for a while, is they introduced a platform where you can pitch Lego ideas. However, before Lego will look at the idea, you need 10,000 supporters, right? And so the example here is from someone who proposed a Lego Minecraft set, and this is in production. You can buy this. But this is actually the particular user is I guess the founder of the creator of Minecraft, and his fans and fans of Lego and Minecraft came together and said, okay, sure, 10,000 votes, no problem. And so for Lego, this was actually very efficient, right? There's loads and loads of ideas, but these guys hit a certain threshold where they said, we have an idea, we've qualified the idea because 10,000 people support it. Now, please, will you look at it? And that's in fact what happened. And so in a traditional environment, Lego may have found this idea through their business development or corporate development, or someone may have had the idea to reach out to the Minecraft team. But here we see a great example of sourcing an idea. The idea is ultimately a licensing partnership. But the way in which that idea came to be was through a filter, through inviting a crowd not just to participate in proposing the ideas, but actually to help to select. And in this case, that was very effective for Lego. And so very quickly you get into this interesting situation in another place where voting is common. And so, for those who follow American Idol, we've talked about it once before, all-time most successful TV show. If you make it through this process, generally guaranteed of stardom of some level or another. But there is actually, if you look on, probably the best starting point, if you look at Wikipedia, and I think I have a link to this on Skillshare, you'll see that the most contentious part of the American Idol process is who is voting, right? So again, if there are people who've decided they like the program and they'd like to influence the outcome, whoever decides to vote is going to influence who gets selected. And so there are certain biases. There may not be as many fans of, say, classical music, or there may not be as many fans of electronic music. And so it turns out that in the US for American Idol, the bias is towards more country. And there's a lot of speculation about why that is. That's not to say it's representative of all the music tastes or the average music taste in the US. It's just representative of the people who have decided to tune in and ultimately vote for people on the show. But this is an important consideration. It's one thing, if I am a partner in a venture capital firm and I pick, that's great. If I'm a creative director and I pick, everyone understands who it is that's qualified to make the decision. When I have a crowd of people, I now have a new thing to worry about, right? So as you think about the recruiting process, you suddenly have to give some consideration to, are these people going to vote? And what skills do they need to vote, right? It's fine if I let people vote on what music they like if they turn out to be the end customer. I may feel very differently if I'm trying to evaluate different energy technologies, right? The end users of the technology are probably not qualified to determine which ones are worthy of an investment or further exploration. So in that case, I really do want a crowd of people who know something about energy. And so it's something important to think about when you're recruiting, and if you're thinking about how you're going to select ideas, who is going to be doing the voting, right? The other part of voting that becomes important, and it may be voting, it may be ratings, you may have people vote on different criteria or rate different criteria. And that's just at a single idea level. But the other thing to consider is when you have 1,000 ideas, how do you make sure that everything gets reviewed equally, right? So it's very usual that as something gains momentum, in other words, as people vote for something, you'll very often see that that idea then moves to the top of a list, right? So you may see it as trending, you might see it as popular, you might see it as most voted for. And so when this happens early on, you may have an idea that in an initial set of, say, 50 is very popular. But very quickly, as other ideas are submitted, they get swamped because they can never get enough votes to actually be considered for additional votes, if that makes sense. And so one way to address those types of issues is a very classic idea from the sports world. So this graphic actually shows, I think it was the World Cup from South Africa, the Soccer World Cup. And this is sort of showing different groups playing, different teams playing each other, eventually resulting in a final. And in this way, the knockout stages sort of give some chance to all the participants. Now, a league format is the same. Obviously, you need many more games, and so that becomes the trade-off. And so something to consider as you organize a process is, on the one end, you can simply let people have as many votes as they want and vote as they see an idea. And you don't really care how they encounter the idea. And so some ideas, if they get submitted late or some other reason they don't make it into the same level of visibility as other ideas, then so be it. But understand that you have a bias. If you design a process such as a knockout tournament or a round robin or a structure where more ideas compete head to head, you have a higher chance that ideas actually get fairly evaluated and looked at, and ultimately that you arrive at the winner. So something else to consider in the voting and rating is not only at the individual idea level, but how ideas are going to be compared. And so where we land up is, in most instances, we see that there's slightly different strengths. At least this has been my experience, is that there are slightly different strengths for each of the groups. We'd like to use experts, but experts are relatively expensive and relatively inefficient, right? So they have their advantages, but in a specific way. The problem for experts is that when we suddenly have an order of magnitude more ideas, which is the most common result if we're doing our crowdstorming process well, they get overwhelmed. So we need a way around that. And so the crowd can play an important role. And so where we think the crowd is most helpful to us is actually as a filter. So we don't actually necessarily want the votes to choose the winner, right? So American Idol, they make it very explicit. If you vote enough, then you choose the winner. We may not actually want that. What we may want is we may want the voting to help us get to, let's say, the top 5 or 10%, right? So eliminate most of the noise, right? So if we have 1,000 ideas, that would mean that we can go from 1,000 to 100, right? So think about it, the difference that makes if we want to use experts. Now we've reduced the workload for experts by a factor of 10, right? So we've got them back into a range where they could usefully work through and evaluate the ideas. And so this is something to think about, is that broadly two different approaches to decision making. The crowd can play a very important role, and I think as you go through crowdstorming processes that have a lot of ideas, you'll really appreciate this. And then experts still have a critical role. There are some things that may still be difficult to vote or rate or make a final decision on and actually choose the one, right? So again, if I think about 1,000 ideas, I've removed 90%, I'm down to 100, maybe that order of the top 100 is not correct. Maybe the number 20 is ideal in the eyes of an expert because they could see how it could be improved and made better than the most voted for choice. Anyway, so something to consider about is hybrids generally win out in decision making, even if they don't necessarily win out everywhere else. Okay, so on to the gotchas. So this is something that already came up in some of the discussion, and chose to put this at the end just because I think the process is, once you understand the process, it's a little bit easier to talk about some of these things. So the first one we're going to call the castle problem. And the castle problem is one where most organizations are set up to sort of protect what they have, right? They're set up to protect things that are inside and protect from stuff that comes outside. And that's all well and good, but it has the disadvantage of really not being open to the world and inviting outside people in, literally. And so, with the castle mentality comes certain policies that really don't encourage you to go and find outside people to work with, right? The protocols are set up in a very defensive mindset. And so that's usually our starting point is, what are all the protocols that we're going to have to overcome that have institutionalized the castle mentality, when what we'd like to do is open out one of the walls. We know that's going to take some convincing. Let's begin with intellectual property, and this is usually the point at which we experience the most resistance, right? And it's not to pick on intellectual property lawyers, it's just the reality. And so the usual issue is that the result of the Crowdstorm needs to be something that can be treated as property, right? It needs to be something that, like the transfer of a car or a home or some other physical property, I could take this idea and I could say, you know what, it's your idea, we can write a contract and you can sell it to me, at which point it becomes my idea. And so it takes on all the attributes of a property, even if it is just a concept that I haven't prototyped or done anything with. And so that really constrains a lot of ideas, right? So think about, different types of design, packaging, strategies. I mean, there really are a lot of ideas that fall outside of what is patentable, right? You may not need something that's novel. You may just need something that is, useful to you right now because you haven't done it before. And so there's lots of reasons why you may not get something or even want something that's patentable, and yet there is a desire to, at the end of this, make sure that your organization has a way to buy something or to take ownership of that thing. And so intellectual property is usually the first stumbling block, because it raises all these interesting issues about, well, how am I going to buy the thing at the end? How am I going to make sure that this person doesn't sell it to someone else? How am I going to make sure that my competitor doesn't get this thing? Right? And so intellectual property is sort of brought forth as the thing that's going to solve all of these problems, and invariably it raises some difficult conversations, and your request to open a huge hole in the side of the castle is denied because it's going to be too risky. And we don't want to let these people in because it actually reduces our ability to defend and own the things that we need. And so the way that organizations work around this, so Procter & Gamble has a way where they simply say, look, we'd love to work with you. Just make sure you have something that's patented, right? So they are fine with the idea that for certain things they need a patent, and they will find people who have them, and those are their first choice for people to work with, right? GE, obviously cares about intellectual property, a lot. You could probably make a case that they care just as much as P&G, maybe even more. And so their way around it was simply to say, look, we don't actually want to own the intellectual property. What we'd like to do is identify a team that has the idea, that can build out the idea, and will invest in that, right? And we'd still like them to have some protection for the idea, but we're not asking to actually purchase it from them. We recognize that to bring it to market, it's going to take IP, but it will take some other expertise. And so we'd like to invest in the team or partner with the team and help it to bring to market the idea. And so that's how they work around the issue. And that gives a hint of sort of where some of these things can go. There are a lot of formats. As you look at the examples, as you go and look back at the Crowdstorm examples that we have, everything from X Prize to Life Edited, Quirky, all of these examples, they do address intellectual property head on, and there's very clear rules about how intellectual property will be handled. If there's the possibility of infringement, what types of guarantees people need to provide. Is it original work? Are there copyright issue? All those types of things are laid out. but the main point is that there are lots of ways to deal with it. This does not need to be a reason to avoid crowdstorming. And I think that's the most important thing for most people going into a large organization who are going to confront this issue is it's very easy to find 20 different examples of ways to deal with IP. Very easy. And we have a bunch of them on Skillshare. And that would be the starting point, is simply to say, look, Department of Defense, GE, P&G, these are organizations that care deeply about intellectual property, and they found a way, we can find a way too. And you can figure out the appropriate needs, but if you start with lots of examples, at least the legal team has some places to start. Okay, so enough about intellectual property, and then our other friend, confidentiality. The other thing that keeps castle walls up is that someone is going to find out what we are doing, what we are thinking, what our major problems are, what we're going to do about these problems. And so confidentiality, there's a reason why things remain confidential in the first place. And for the most part, again, there's a trade-off. If we let people in a little bit, they may learn more about what we're doing. But the benefit to us is that we find the talent, we find the ideas, we find the partners that let us move forward. And so as a starting point, I think the question is, okay, so we've announced that we're trying to solve a problem. What are the implications of someone knowing that we're working on this problem? And would they be able to find it out anyway, right? And very often, let's assume a competitor did find out about what we were working on or what we were trying to solve. What they then potentially find out is, here's all the ideas that you're looking at, and maybe they find out, here's your top 10%, right? But it may take them a long time to figure out ultimately which one you've decided to do a deal on. And if you do deals for multiple of them, it becomes very hard for them to figure out which one you actually want to focus on, right? So if you look at GE and Ecomagination as an example, they've done 20 deals. If you're competing with GE, that's great. You went from thousands of ideas down to 20. And so now you have a better sense of what's important to them. But you still don't know which are the most important. And you would probably have found out a lot of this information anyway, because these companies would show up and start selling their products or services anyway. So confidentiality, I think, it's sort of a little bit easier than intellectual property. I think you can reason through it a little bit easier in terms of what happens if someone found out. Could they find out another way? And assuming they know what we're trying to solve, if we're picking multiple ideas to take forward, they still don't know where we believe the most success is going to come from. And in a lot of cases, we're at the point where we have talent, we have prototypes, we have partners. There's still a lot of investment and problems to solve before we can actually turn this into something big and valuable, which is usually the thing that competitors are concerned about. Okay, so that's confidentiality. So moving on, the other part of this is is risk to the brand, right? So we've talked about property and the ownership of things and wanting to maintain control over the ownership and wanting to control the flow of information so that competitors don't find out what things that they shouldn't know. But there's also substantial risk to the brand, right? So you're doing very often crowdstorms in a public space. I'm not suggesting this is the equivalent of going to a mall or a very public space, but certainly there are people from outside the company who can see what you're doing. And this is an example of Mountain Dew, who's worked a lot in the space, and they've had their share of issues. And I'm not using the Mountain Dew example, to sort of say that these guys don't know what they're doing. I think they do. They've actually worked through a lot of these challenges. But here's an example of, I want my customers to be able to vote. Makes sense. Makes total sense. There's two reasons why it makes sense, for the same reason that American Idol makes sense, which is, one, I may actually learn something about which ideas are better, and two, I'm getting people to participate, right? As a brand who's interested in something, often called engagement, right? I want people to talk to me. I want people to interact with me. I want them to feel like they have some part of what I do as a business, that I'm not always just selling to them. I'm actually involving them in some decisions. This was very smart. It's very smart. But as you can see from the names, this is not great. It sort of looks bad for Mountain Dew that the winning idea is diabetes. It's hard enough to deal with sugar discussions if you're in the soda industry, and to have this come up and have then the media sort of point fingers at you and laugh at your failure. No one's feeling very good, right? The CMO and the team who put this together really, this is probably a difficult experience for them. So how can you anticipate these types of things? And so I think, there's a very close relationship between all of these gotchas, which is, there are things that you can do in the way that you set up the brief, in the way that you set up incentives, in the way that you think about what pattern that you want to use. Who's going to vote, right? Here's a classic example. I can involve fewer people in voting. The downside is that maybe I get less attention because I don't have something for everyone to do. I can't just come off Facebook and start voting. But the flip side is that maybe I get less engagement, but maybe I then get a better sample and I actually do find interesting names that I can use. And so that's a subtle shift on the pattern, but if we just look at your decision around voting, right, what's the impact of that? Well, this is one way to reduce risk. I'm just not going to let anyone come in and vote. If I do, right, if I do let anyone in, I may have some rules about that. I may simply say that I want to reserve the right to delete some names, right, or some ideas because they're not appropriate, right? That may have its own consequences, but again, it's a way of working with people where you said to them explicitly, look, if you were a full-time employee and you did something that fell outside of the employee handbook, we'd have a right to let you go or at least discipline you. Communities are not that different. If I'm inviting you into an environment to work with me, we have rules. And if you break the rules, then I am allowed to act. And one of those rules in the case of Mountain Dew could very easily have been, we have some brand guidelines, we have some things that we think are good for the brand, and we have some things that we think would be bad for the brand. We don't want ideas that are going to embarrass us. So we reserve the right, if we see those ideas, to remove them or to ask you to remove them, or ultimately, if you insist, to find someone else to work on the problem. So let's move on. Another problem, and these are, we've moved from sort of, pretty hard issues of intellectual property and confidentiality, and then into softer issues of brand, and now we're getting into really softer issues around sort of company culture and issues that are really just ways that people have come to understand their role in a firm, right? And so if you go into, let's say, a research department in most organizations, part of the pride of being in that role is that you are the source of new products or new services or new ideas. That's part of the territory, right? And so with that very often comes this idea of not invented here. In other words, just because something comes from outside the castle, I should treat it suspiciously, right? I should, in some cases, just reject it simply because it didn't come from my team. It didn't come from inside the company. It didn't come from the very talented people that you hired with the express intent of researching and testing and coming up with ideas, right? So now I'm facing this challenge, and this is very often the case, is it simply I could go and get great ideas, and I could run through a whole Crowdstorm process and find myself at the end with a great idea that I'd like to partner with or I'd like to license. And then I find that my organization is actually simply not interested in it for whatever series of reasons that will be offered. Ultimately, this idea has no hope of continuing development inside the organization because it wasn't created here in the first place. And so, again, there are ways to address this, right? And so, if you look at, P&G's expressly from the CEO level down has made it okay to get things from outside and work with them to build a business, right? So you might say, look, if I'm a person who's in marketing and I'm a product person who is looking for the next great business that we can build out, if my senior management have made it okay for me to do this, then it makes it easier. I can simply say, I could have gone to our internal research team. They have a bunch of other things that they're working on. So we saw the opportunity. We want to make sure that we have an idea that we can build on. So we went outside, and that's our approach. And if the senior team makes that okay, generally, that becomes okay. The less risky ways, if you can't get the whole company to sort of say this is okay, there are less risky ways to approach this. Again, investing in an idea or partnering with a team versus buying something from them and then developing it yourself is often an option. And then there are also very particular skill sets. So you could look at this from the perspective of we don't have the skills internally, or we don't have enough of the skills internally. So, for example, there's a site called Kaggle, and Kaggle is all about taking large sets of data and analyzing and modeling the data. Now, those types of problems are often very easy for organizations to get on board with for one simple reason. They don't have a large staff of data scientists, right? So they don't have internal people who are saying, oh, we didn't make this here, because there really is no one who has the skills to create the types of things that you can do on Kaggle. And so that's another way to think about this, is to say, when you pick a problem, it may span areas of expertise, or it may include things that your organization typically doesn't do. You may require game designers, you may require artists, you may require any number of people or skills that are not typically found inside your organization. And so that's another way to look at not invented here, if you don't have sort of organizational buy-in from the very top. All right, so those are some of the gotchas. There are more, but those are very often the biggest ones: intellectual property, confidentiality, risk to the brand, and then just rejecting things because they're not invented here. And so finally, we're going to get to this point. We've assumed throughout that there is some sort of technology or some magic that lets us work together, thousands of us at a time, on the internet, right? And so there's a very particular word here, which is not platform or technology, but space. And the space is important because very often it's not just the technology, it's also that there may already be some people in the space, right? So there may be an existing group that has interacted socially, or that's done a Crowdstorm together before, or it's not just technology. There's the space is more than that. It's also relationships. And so as you think about this, you can go through the whole process and think about when we're asking the right questions, if we want to provide incentives, etc. Eventually, I've got all these people, coming into a space. It makes a difference if in that space, those people know each other, right? So very often this would be a reason to say, let's work together internally with a team that knows each other, that is already, using some tools already, have used a blog, have used a wiki, has a shared workspace on Microsoft SharePoint, is using Yammer, is connected through Facebook in a group, any number of existing structures that have built a relationship. Those spaces are fine, right? They will serve the purpose of bringing those people together and letting you interact to do a Crowdstorm. Where those spaces fall down is that they don't have some of the structures. So, for example, if you're doing search, it's fine to use really anything, right? At the end of the day, if you're doing search, all you need at some point is a place where someone can email their answer. That's enough. The space that you choose can lean very heavily on where people are and where they interact already. And all of the focus of the space is on the relationships and the people and how they communicate. And you don't need the space to actually facilitate any aspects of the pattern. And so if we look at this a different way, just in a simple comparison, in a search pattern, I'm really just concerned about managing, monitoring and support, right? So I could run a search pattern in social media. I have the monitoring tools. If someone has questions, I can respond to them. So between social media and email, I'm covered. I really don't need a specialized space. I just need a way for someone to send me an idea. But what you'll notice is, as we've talked about collaboration patterns, we've got different needs, right? I need some way to do collective choice, right? For people to sort of talk about what they would like and express an opinion and potentially vote. I need a way to make sure that people are getting value. So if someone is, giving me an idea, that's one thing. If someone is offering feedback, I need a way to measure their feedback so that I can give them something in return. I can recognize them and ultimately, very often pay them, right? And I need, I need these elements in order to be able to manage the process. And so if you layer on top of this the idea that I've got a voting process, and within the voting process I want to know if people are trying to manipulate the process. I have to monitor and make sure that no one's trying to undermine it, right? I need that if I'm going to have a sanctioning system. I need a monitoring system that's going to let me do some very specific things like monitor voting, right? So if I'm on Facebook and people are liking something, that's great, but if they have just told their friends to like it, I have no way to know that, and I can't stop them from doing anything, right? And so the main thing to think about as you choose a space is the more complex the pattern, the more you're going to need a purpose-designed space, right? The less complicated the pattern. In other words, if you're just focusing on getting ideas, you can use pretty much anything, right? Anywhere where you can present the brief and people can send you ideas, you're good to go. And that's the main thing to bear in mind. I'm not going to propose specific vendors. I'm not going to get into any of that. Skillshare actually, from our perspective, is doing a lot of the things that we need, right? The ideas are posted, you're able to comment and vote, and we ultimately can select a winner in that way. We'll discuss some of the things that we would, additional things that we'd want to see. But it's for demonstrating the ideas, it's perfect. All right, so that concludes the sort of introduction to all the material. There's lots of links, and so there's a lot more reading, and then you have the ebooks too. So if you really want to go further, we actually address the gotchas right up front in the way the book is written, and then the decision making, again, is towards the end. And so let's get back to the traffic congestion. And so if you followed along so far, in the first module we said let's focus on ideas. In the second module we said let's focus on feedback. And in this module we're going to focus on voting. And so that's really what we want to do over the next few days is choose your winner. And we will be talking again soon during office hours. Thanks very much.